Good day to you. You know, the odds are that every single person in this class can think back to one of their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents. Perhaps you have to go as far back as your great parents, but you've got somebody who immigrated to the United States. And that makes us a nation of immigrants in many ways. And we're going to be talking about that in today's class because today's class, chapter 10, is all about immigration and acculturation. Acculturation is the ability of an immigrant to adapt to the culture, the new culture in which you're living. And as you know from my own particular background, from my intro speech, my parents were British, and I can relate very closely to a lot of the things talked about in this chapter, as I'm sure that many of you in this class have. If you have heritage that comes from Italy or Ireland or parts of Africa or Israel or wherever your ancestors are coming from to provide you with an immigration background. One of the first concepts talked about by Fred Yant is this idea of culture shock. It's the feeling that you get when you move to a new place and everything is different. And it's very disorienting and very stressful to people who immigrate from another country to a new country. And there's different phases, 5 stages, I should say. That's what Fred Yant calls them, that a person goes through when they move to another country. I don't know if anybody in this class has ever had the opportunity to go to another country for an extended period of time. If so, you might have experienced these stages. Stage 1 is the honeymoon stage. And that's where everything is great. You know, you look around, you say, oh, it's the beautiful mountains here in Pennsylvania. I'm from China. There's beautiful mountains here. Or you look around and you are caught up with how the weather is better than where you came from. The honeymoon phase, everything appears to be delightful. But soon after that becomes the disintegration of familiar cues phase. And this is where you start to miss those things that you're used to seeing and hearing. I mean, even the rhythm of street noise can be very different depending on the country that you go to. For example, if you go into England, you hear a lot more diesel engines because the diesel engine is more used in Europe in general and especially in England. So the sound of the streets is just very different. And something like that, it can be a great loss to you if that's part of what reassures you that your surroundings are familiar. So the disintegration of familiar cues is the next phase. And then that's followed by the reintegration of new cues. And now we're starting to see overcoming culture shock when you get into this phase, because now you're starting to adopt the new sights and sounds of cultures. In Mexico, for example, when you pass a person on the street and you're expected to wave to them and smile because it's part of Mexican culture that you are wishing them good health. And so if you don't smile and wave at somebody, you're also in a way saying that you're not wishing them good health. So you never want to do that. It's not necessarily offensive, but it's a little off-putting. If you start doing that when you're in Mexico, you're reintegrating some new cues. That's followed then by the fourth phase, which is gradual adjustment to the culture. You start to get used to its way of life, the clothes that people wear, the practices that people, the way that people practice religion or non-religion, the kinds of ways that people go shopping. And then eventually, hopefully, you reach reciprocal interdependence, which is a kind of another term for it is biculturalism, where you're able to exist both as a person from an original different culture and you're able to exist quite comfortably in the new culture. You know, there are some symptoms of culture shock. One of the first symptoms has to do with physical symptoms, where everything around you that you can see and touch and feel basically feels uncomfortable. So you get concerned about the cleanliness of the food in the country that you're eating. And I know that when I took my students to China a couple years ago, one of the first things that they were doing was looking down at the plates of food that they had. A lot of food you couldn't recognize. You just don't see it over here. And they were very concerned about whether it was clean or not. And this was kind of one of the symptoms of culture shock. There's also physiological symptoms as well. Insomnia, fatigue, and isolation and loneliness can occur when you're in a new culture. Now, the book goes on to talk about immigration. Immigration I found to be a very fascinating discussion in this particular chapter, the way that Fred Yant treats it. And he does make the point early on that without immigration, most countries' populations would decline. They don't sustain themselves. So immigration, it helps a population grow, We also know that immigration occurs mainly because of labor force adjustments. Oftentimes, wealthier countries, such as the United States or Germany, rely on immigrants to perform jobs that the people who live in those countries don't want to perform. They could be agricultural jobs, they could be custodial jobs, they could be manufacturing jobs. And so, those are some forces for immigration. About 3.2% of the world's population right now lives outside of their birth country. It's a little bit smaller than I would have guessed, but still significant. And there's a theory to explain immigration. It's called the push-pull theory. And the push side of this theory says that people leave their country because the conditions that they're in are not suitable to them. They live in a disadvantaged area. There's no opportunity for jobs, or perhaps there's a war or conflict that's going on, so they leave to get away from that. The pull theory is just the opposite. It's that something in this other country that you're going to is bringing you to it. Maybe it's the idea that if you move to Belgium, you're going to be close to a bunch of European countries, and so you're willing to be pulled by that attraction. Now the chapter goes into individual countries and talks about some of their immigration history, and it starts with Israel, which was only formed in 1948. It's one of the most recent countries that we have. And originally there was a law passed in 1950 in Israel that allowed any person born of a Jewish mother outside of Israel to re-emigrate back to Israel and to become a citizen. They would be called an Oleh, O-L-E-H. That law was extended in 1970 to include anybody born of Jewish parents. And so that created a situation where a lot of Jews, which had been dispersed across the world or had dispersed themselves, depending on how you want to look at it, if you read ancient Roman history, Jews were allowed to return to Israel, and it helped to create this nation state that it is today. And that includes, by the way, Ethiopian Jews, which are discussed in the chapter. There's a strong contingent of Ethiopian Jews or Black African Jews who have returned to Israel. And then there's also a huge population of Soviet Jews in Israel, which is one of the tiniest countries in the world. You have the third largest Russian community in the world. Western Europe is discussed next. In Western Europe, immigration is a relatively recent phenomenon, although if you go to ancient history and you look at the Ottoman Turks and you look at the way that the Anglo-Saxons and other tribal peoples moved around Europe, I mean, you had immigration there, but in the modern history of Western Europe, you don't really have a lot of people moving into Western Europe until recently. Most of the people that are coming into Europe in the last 20 years or so are Muslim. They're coming from war-torn countries. They're coming from countries where there's economic disadvantages. A lot of Moroccans, for example, Islamic Moroccans from the country of Morocco in northern Africa have returned to Europe to seek opportunities. I can tell you that in Sweden, a country that I've mentioned several times in this class, there's a very big population of Islamic Muslims. Well, that's redundant, but there's a large population of Muslims, and prior to that, Sweden was a very homogenous culture. Like everywhere you look, everybody has blonde hair and blue eyes. And so the complexion of Sweden is changing really rather radically, as it is also for other Western countries. Among them, France has a lot of immigration from Algeria, which used to be a colony in Africa, and is right across the Mediterranean from France. And a lot of Algerians are coming into France, seeking employment and seeking the way of life that France offers. The Netherlands is highlighted in the book as one country that experimented for a while with a policy of multiculturalism, that is allowing foreigners to move into the country and to keep their own traditions. But then Holland, or as is also known, the Netherlands, decided this was a bad idea. It's just creating segregated populations within the country, and they abandoned that policy, and they have even placed a ban on burqas, the female headdress and full-length dress that is worn in Muslim countries to force acculturation. Brazil is also an interesting country. It's a huge country. It's just behind the United States in terms of its size. It's the fourth biggest country in the world. And it also is a country that has a strong history of immigration and multiculturalism, you can say, because people have come from all over the world. They've come from Europe that Japan and even the United States, a lot of Southerners after the Civil War immigrated to Brazil. I was very interested to read that and didn't know about that myself. Of course, Brazil also has a strong contingent of African slave and African slave descendants that are living in Brazil. 4 million slaves came to Brazil to work on the sugar cane plantations versus 500,000 in the United States. So Brazil has the largest slave derived population. And that's perhaps why it was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888, long after the United States did, some 20 years later. There's also a strong Korean contingent that has moved to Brazil. And as a result of all these different races as well as others, because Brazil touches so many South American countries, there's only two that don't. One of them is Ecuador that does not touch Brazil. Because it's surrounded by all these countries, it gets immigration from those countries as well. And so it's no surprise that in the world, Fred Yant believes that there's probably the highest degree of intermarriage in Brazil. That means marriage between races and ethnicities. Now moving on to our own United States, the U.S. is host to more immigrants than any other nation. And it's important to mention here that that's primarily because the indigenous population, or what we used to refer to as Indians, was essentially wiped out by the U.S. government and placed on reserves. It's very difficult to find people of pure Indian or pure indigenous heritage, but that sort of wiped the slate in the country. And then, of course, when the U.S. was discovered by, well, not really Christopher Columbus, but that's who we celebrate, then people started moving here because it was the new world, the free world. And so we have 20% of the world's population here in the United States, and many of them are immigrants. And right here in Pennsylvania has got a very interesting history. There were 3 states that welcomed immigrants very early on, but the other 2 states did not have were not as open-minded to immigrants as Pennsylvania is. Pennsylvania welcomed all manner of immigrants, and treated them on equal footing. And some of the immigrants that took advantage of that were the Irish and the Italians and the Germans and the Swiss. The Swiss came here as Amish, and if you go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania on a Sunday and you're going out for a drive, you better be prepared to be slowed down by an Amish buggy on a country road. They've maintained their entire culture intact within Pennsylvania. Very interesting history. Many of you in this class will have Italian or German or Irish heritage, just like many Pennsylvanians. The U.S. has had several policies over the years dealing with immigration. In 1798, there was the Act Concerning Aliens, which prohibited certain kinds of immigrants coming to this country. But really, it was the 14th Amendment, not necessarily as a policy, but it's an amendment to our Constitution, which has made it possible that anybody who is born in the United States is automatically a U.S. citizen. So you do have lots of people from disadvantaged countries, Mexico being the main one, where the mother and the father actually plan a vacation so that their child can be born in the U.S. and then they're a citizen, and they have that chance to come to the United States. In 1875, there were a series of federal laws that were created banning certain categories of immigrants like prostitutes and mental patients. And then later on in 1921, the U.S. government adopted a policy of quotas, and that is allowing certain numbers of people to come in from countries that already had established populations here in the United States, and there would be a quota set, and you could apply to come in as long as that quota had not been met. That's how my parents came to the United States, as Britain, at the time that they came in the 1950s, had a high quota of British people, and they were allowed to apply and move to the United States. Later on in 1990, the Immigration Act raised the level of immigration from 540,000 to 700,000 people. It's approximately how many people are processed and allowed to enter the country as immigrants today. Ellis Island, you may have heard about, a small island in New York, processed most of the immigrants. Many of you will have spellings of your last name in this class that have been altered because the immigrants who arrived and came through Ellis Island could not sometimes read or write, and so their names were mistranslated, and a C would go missing from your name, or the name would have a different spelling than the original Italian name. Very, very common. And of course, here in the United States, we have our own history of slavery, providing much of the immigration to the country as well. Now the book moves on to predictors of acculturation, trying to understand exactly what contributes to how well you adapt to the new country that you move to. And there's a theory to provide that kind of explanation of how well you will acculturate or adapt, and that's called the cross-cultural adaptation theory. And it basically is a process of going through stress, then culture shock, then adaptation. But there are 5 components of this theory. The first is the degree to which you have communication competence in the host culture. So that has to do with how well you're able to communicate using the language of the country that you're in, and also the cues, the social cues, like the smiling and waving Mexico that I mentioned. Also, the next element is the participation in the host social communication. That means how much do you mix with groups? Do you go to church gatherings? Do you play sports? Do you get together with your neighbors? This also has a lot to do with how well you adapt to a country. And then there is the participation in ethnic social communication. That means communicating with people that are like you from another country, and especially people who came from the same country that you did. When I go to Mexico, there's a whole group of Americans and Canadians on the street that I live, and we get together with them, in part because it reminds us of our familiarity, but also because we face some of the same circumstances as being non-Mexican citizens. Next up is the host environment. That has to do with how welcoming it is, and is it open to are people friendly to immigrants? Are there opportunities through government programs for you to get financial assistance or employment or workforce training? It has to do with host environment. And then lastly, there's predisposition. It has to do with your attitude before you come to the country. Are you open-minded, or are you being forced out of where you came from because it's war-torn and you're not really open to adopting to the new culture and the lifestyle of the place that you're living? That finishes then, that just about finishes the chapter. The last thing that I want to talk about is different categories of acculturation. There's different ways that people adapt in a new country. One is marginalization. That's not an ideal adaptation because that's where you lose your cultural identity, but you also feel like you're placed to the side within the culture that you live. So you lose, if you're Italian, you lose your Italianness. But at the same time, it's not like you're meeting with and having great experiences with Americans. You feel very isolated. That's what marginalization is all about. Another category of acculturation is separation and segregation. You can go to almost any big city in the United States and find a Chinatown, San Francisco, Philadelphia, New York. That's where you kind of set up your own mini country within another country, and you're segregated and you don't speak the language of the new country, but you're living in it, and you're kind of living in it in a way that is mimicking where you came from. Then there's the category of assimilation, and this is where you're starting now you speak the language, you have values that come from the country that you're in, you participate in events that other people in your neighborhood participate in, you're assimilating, you're part of the country. But the best and final category of acculturation is integration. And that's where you're really not even aware that you come from a different background, a different country. You're so intertwined with the American way of life or whatever country that you've moved to that you're fully integrated and successful and happy. And so that's going to wrap up our material today on immigration and acculturation. Have a great day.